What's up, everybody? Welcome to Kenny Kinetics, where learning is made easy. Let's go! The purpose of this video today is to go through the basic structures of the heart. We're just going to do basic labeling and know the order of blood flow through the heart. Nothing crazy here. Everything's going to be basic. But here at Kenny Kinetics, if you rock with me through this journey, we're going to start off at that basic level, and we're just going to keep adding layers on layers on layers on layers so that you know a lot about the heart by the time that we are done with this playlist. So let's go. Let's get it. Let's dive into this information, ladies and gentlemen. So again, the first thing we're going to do is just talk about labeling different structures of the heart, and we're just going to follow that flow one step at a time. So when you're resting or when you're exercising, you have an exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. The oxygen travels within the blood and it keeps going and going until it gets into the muscles. Now, when the oxygen gets into the muscles through the artery, the oxygen will flow into the muscle so that the muscle can use that oxygen. When the muscle uses that oxygen, it depletes the oxygen and then it gives off carbon dioxide. So then that carbon dioxide is going to flow through the venules into the veins, and then it's going to travel until it gets back to the heart. So what you need to know is that when it's traveling through those veins, it's going to keep going until it comes to one of three structures. One of the structures that it can encounter is this one right here, called the superior vena cava. Again, the superior vena cava is taking all of that deoxygenated blood that contains carbon dioxide from the head and the neck. It's draining all of that down into the superior vena cava here. The same follows suit for this structure right here, which is the inferior vena cava. And the inferior vena cava is grabbing all of that deoxygenated blood from your lower body, and it's coming up through those venules, those veins, until it travels up into the inferior vena cava. The last of the third structures that is going to carry deoxygenated blood is this little hole right here within the heart, and this is called the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus is taking that deoxygenated blood filled with carbon dioxide from the heart itself, and that is draining into the coronary sinus. So the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus, they all link up. They dap each other up, and they're like, meet me at the right atrium. So that's the first chamber right here. And this first chamber, again, is called the right atrium. So the right atrium is like, oh, all my friends is here, let's go. I got my superior vena cava, I got my inferior vena cava, and I got my coronary sinus. Now I got all the squad here ready to go. So we have all that deoxygenated blood within the right atrium. The right atrium is like, let's go, like we trying to go on a mission. So let's get there. And the right atrium has to talk to this structure right here before it can get to the next chamber. So the right atrium has to go through this white structure that you see right here and here, which is called the tricuspid valve. Now it's called tricuspid valve because if you look at it within a cadaver, it has 3 leaflets, and those 3 leaflets are the valves that basically it keeps the blood going in one direction. So when the heart is in diastole, which is it's at rest and it's relaxing, blood that's coming from the inferior vena cava, the coronary sinus, and the superior vena cava is just pooling into the right atrium, which is also going to come into this second chamber that we're going to meet, 2 of 4 chambers, which is called the right ventricle. So as that deoxygenated blood is coming into the right atrium here, it's also pooling into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. So that blood keeps going and going into the right ventricle, but it has to go through the tricuspid valve here. So the tricuspid valve has this string-like cord attachment here, this white string that you see here, and that's called the chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae. And now the chordae tendineae is also connected to this little blue structure right there, and that's called the papillary muscle. So the tricuspid valve, again, when the heart is relaxed, all that deoxygenated blood is able to come from the right atrium into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. But now, once all of that blood's going through, when the atrium decides to contract, which another word for contract is called systole, the papillary muscle will contract itself, and it's going to pull on the chordae tendineae. Now, when it pulls on the chordae tendineae, it's going to pull those 3 leaflets shut. So now, all of that deoxygenated blood that was flowing from the right atrium and the right ventricle can no longer flow through, because now this valve is going to be closed. Now that all of the blood is going to be in the right ventricle is going to begin to contract, which again, just keep these 2 words together. Contract and systole mean the same thing. Anatomists like to come up with 15 million different words for the same thing. So to keep everything together, I'm going to try to group those terms together so you knock it in your head and you know what they mean. So when the right ventricle contracts, aka systole, it's going to push blood against this valve right here. And the next valve that we're going to come across is the pulmonary valve. Now the pulmonary valve is going to allow for blood to travel through the right ventricle into this structure here, which is called the pulmonary trunk. So we're going to go to the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk goes through pulmonary arteries, and those pulmonary arteries will go to the lungs. So where my cursor is, the left lung would be here, and then the right lung would be here. So up until this point, we've been talking about deoxygenated blood. So you may be wondering, well, where does the oxygen come from? And that's where the killer lungs come in. They're like, all right, this is my time, this is my part of the mission, and what I gotta do is I gotta participate in that gas exchange. So the job of the lungs is to take that carbon dioxide, and it's gonna exhale it out into the air. So when you breathe in and breathe out, when you're breathing out, that carbon dioxide that has been in the blood flow up until this point is all gonna get exhaled out. Then when you breathe in, you're bringing in oxygen. So the lungs is like, yeah, buddy, got my oxygen. I'm going to go ahead and get that gas exchange through the alveoli. And then I'm going to bring oxygen into the blood. So that's why typically they represent deoxygenated blood with blue and then oxygenated blood with red. So now that the lungs, on this part of the mission, the lungs, like I did my part, I got that oxygen, I'm ready to go. Let me send it to the next station. So that new oxygenated blood from the lungs is going to travel, and then it's going to come into the pulmonary veins. So that red that you see on this side is called the pulmonary veins here, here. And they're also on this side here and here. But if you're seeing that at the back side of the heart, these 2 red structures actually come across over and they dump into the 3rd chamber. And the 3rd chamber that we encounter here is called the left atrium. Now the left atrium has all of that oxygenated blood. And that blood is going to travel down into the last chamber that we have here, which is going to be called the left ventricle. And of course, just like the right side, the left atrium has to go through this little checkpoint, which is called the bicuspid which is also called the mitral valve. And it's called bicuspid or mitral because bi, two, so it has two leaflets instead of three like the tricuspid valve over here. And again, the job of the bicuspid valve with its papillary muscles here and its chordae tendineae is that as the blood's coming through the left atrium, it's going to be relaxed, aka diastole, and it's going to allow blood to come through the left ventricle. But then when the left ventricle becomes full and contracts, aka systole, the papillary muscles is also going to contract and it's going to close the bicuspid / mitral valve shut, so that way all of the blood stays within the left ventricle and it doesn't go back into the atria. Because if the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves didn't close, then blood would just go right back into the atria and we'd never get blood pumping through the heart and ultimately throughout the body. So that's why these valves are super, super, super important. So once the bicuspid valve is closed through that contraction, what's the word that's paired with contraction? Systole. That's going to be closed and then it's going to come through this valve right here. And this valve over here is called the aortic valve. And now it's going to go through the aortic valve into this last structure here, which is called the big old aorta. And the aorta is going to get all of that oxygenated blood and it's going to take it up into the head. It's going to take it down to the descending aorta, which is going to go to the rest of the body, and then boom, that's how your body gets oxygen, and then the cycle continues on and on and on and on. So just a recap here, we'll have deoxygenated blood with carbon dioxide coming from the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. It's going to dump into the right atrium. The right atrium is going to be relaxed, aka diastole. It's going to allow for blood to pool through the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. Once the ventricle starts to get full through pressure systems, which we'll talk about in a later video, the tricuspid valve is going to begin to contract, and when it contracts, it's going to it's going to shut so that blood can't come back from the right ventricle into the right atrium. So we're keeping that one-way system going. And going onwards with the mission, once the blood's in the right ventricle, it's going to keep pulling in here, and then it's going to contract. And then when it contracts, it's going to shoot throughout the pulmonary valve. The pulmonary valve is going to lead to the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is going to go into the right and the left lungs. Within the lungs, gas exchange occurs where you breathe out that carbon dioxide, you inhale the oxygen. The oxygen gets carried within the blood until it gets to the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins will dump into the left atrium. The left atrium will pull blood into the left ventricle, will contract, aka systole, and then the papillary muscles will contract, pull on the chordae tendineae, keeping that valve shut. Now the blood's in the left ventricle. Pressure is going to continue to rise and build within the left ventricle until it shoots through the aortic valve. And then the blood's going to go from the aortic valve into the aorta. Then it's going to go through up into the head and the neck. The rest is going to go down through the descending aorta, and it's going to go through the rest of the body. Again, like I said before, anatomists love coming up with 10 million different names for the same structure. So just so you guys know, the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve / mitral valve can also be referred to collectively as the atrioventricular valves. So I'm just going to write it up here. The atrioventricular valves, aka the AV valves. The reason why they're called the AV valves is because they are between the atrium and the ventricle. The pulmonary valve and the aortic valve together, they're called semilunar valves. Just because of the shape of the valves, again, in the cadaver, they kind of look like crescent moons. So apparently they just wanted to call it semilunar valves. We just got to rock with it. So let's just put that to memory. And then just the last of our labeling here, this structure here is just the muscular septum. And as you can see, at least that I tried to depict, that the right ventricle is thinner, but the left ventricle has a lot more muscle. And that's because the left ventricle has to pump blood to your whole entire body. So it has to go through all these arteries and arterioles, and it has to get all the way to your little pinky toe. So that's a lot of work for the left ventricle to keep that going up throughout your lifespan. So that's why we got the big guns. We need them big muscles so that we can pump it through all those little arteries and arterioles so we can get it to your little pinky. But see, your right ventricle only has to pump blood to the lungs. So it doesn't have to go that much of a distance, and that's why we only have a little bit of muscle here. So within the thing that separates the right ventricle and the left ventricle is this septum here, and that's just called the interventricular septum. So the interventricular septum. Alright, so for my visual people out there, I just wanted to break down one of the AV valves to show you what I mean when the valves contract and when they relax. So here is a depiction of the bicuspid valve. And where is that valve located? Yeah, it's located on the left side of the heart between the left atrium and the left ventricle. It's also called bicuspid/mitral/AV valve. Let's go. So when the valve is relaxed, blood is able to come through and flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle. But then as the pressure starts to build and when the left ventricle is ready to contract, aka systole, the papillary muscle is going to pull on the chordae tendineae, which is going to pull the leaflet shut. So now as you can see, if blood within the left atrium tries to come through here, it can't. It's just going to bounce right back because now the valve is closed and blood can't come down into the left ventricle. It's not allowing the blood to come in here. So that's how the heart maintains its flow through that one-way system through these valves. So these valves are super, super, super important. Alright, everyone. So again, I like to do stuff for my visual learners out there. I think it really makes sense once you get to see everything visually. So I just drew out basically the arteries in the heart going into the body, into those capillaries, which will be the arterioles, transitioning into the venules, then back into the veins. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. The first thing that's going to happen again, like I said, what are those three structures? The superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. They're going to get all that deoxygenated blood from the upper portion of your body, the lower portion of your body, and the heart itself. And it's going to keep going until all of that deoxygenated blood pulls into the right atrium right there. Now the blood is going to keep pulling into the right ventricle until the right ventricle is able to contract, and then it's going to pull on the papillary muscles, which pull on the chordae tendineae, which will shut that tricuspid valve. So then all the blood up until this point is now going to be in the right ventricle. The pressure within the right ventricle is going to continue to rise until it's able to eject blood through the pulmonary valve. And then the pulmonary valve is going to go into the pulmonary trunk, which will bring that deoxygenated blood into the lungs. So within that deoxygenated blood, that carbon dioxide that we have is going to be exhaled out into the air. And then when we breathe in that oxygen, it's going to come through and participate in that gas exchange. And then the lungs will take that oxygen and put it into the blood. and then blood's going to continue to pool until it goes through the pulmonary veins and then into the left atrium. So now we got that oxygen. We're ready to keep giving our muscles the energy that it needs. So the oxygenated blood is going to come into the left atrium. It's going to travel through the bicuspid, aka the mitral, aka the atrioventricular valve, and blood's going to keep pooling, and it's going to go into the left ventricle. Blood's going to keep rising in here until the pressure within the ventricle increases more and more and more. And then once the pressure in the ventricle is big enough, it's going to push through the aortic valve, and then it's going to go into the aorta, and then the aorta is going to pump all of that blood into the upper half of your body. Then the descending aorta is going to pump the rest of that blood into the lower half of your body, and then the cycle will just continue on and on and on. So if you like this video today, I'm going to need you to go ahead and press like, subscribe to my channel. Again, thanks for listening to this video. Rock with me in this journey, and I'm dedicated to your learning, and we're just going to learn together and learn as much as possible. Feel free to drop some comments and let me know how I did. Let me know if there's anything that I can do to help further your learning, and we're just going to improve and get better together. So let's go, everybody. Good job today. Be on the lookout for my second video. I'm going to go through the coronary circulation of the heart, and then we can make sense of all of this together.